Hi, my name is Tristan Rice, Director of Methodology with an emphasis in training systems from Exos.
And I'm Kapil Parakh, Cardiologist and Medical Lead at Fitbit.
Today we want to talk to you about physical activity guidelines and heart rate training zones and the way that you can use the information from wearables to track that with your members.
So let's get started with the physical activity guidelines.
Absolutely, yeah.
An important topic. You know, the government's put out like a 770-page report on this.
Oh yeah, keep it on my bedside table. It helps me get to sleep at night.
So unless you're like Tristan, we're going to break it down and get into the details of what that actually says. So one of the things I say is I can condense that into like 6 words.
Oh.
Move more.
Yeah.
Huff and puff sometimes.
Okay.
So what that means is essentially there are 2 main axes of physical activity that they recommend. One is just movement, get more movement in the course of the day. Now, Fitbit, for example, has historically been 10,000 steps, and there's been a lot of back and forth on that exact number. And I think that misses the point a little bit, because it's not whether you took 6,000 or 7,000, it's the fact that you got more movement over the course of the day.
Absolutely.
Just for the record, like over the last 5 years, there have been numerous studies that have like, first, like, no, maybe it's 7,000, maybe it's 8,000.
Sure.
The ones that came out last week, which are the largest on this topic, said, no, it's actually 10,000. So, like, yes, you could say that it's still reasonable to shoot for that number, but I think it's really more important to see where your client's at. Because if you're dealing with somebody who's more on the couch potato end of the spectrum, and their average is 3,000 steps a day, trying to tell them to get to 10,000 is ridiculous. You want to go up like 10, 20% or something like that. So before we get to the huff and puff, which is the modern vigorous physical activity, I was going to turn over to you and say, like, how do you work that into like your advice?
Yeah, when we recommend game plan activities, one of the things that we recommend are what we call daily movement. Okay. And when we think about daily movement, there's really 2 ways that we can sort of approach that, depending on the thing that the person is trying to get ready for. Yeah. It could be that they're training for an event, like a triathlon or a marathon or something like this. And in that case, we would want to use this daily movement session, which is like sort of a mini kind of training session outside of the gym, outside of that 1 hour, on the idea that if you come to the gym and you exercise for an hour a day and then go sit at your desk for 8 hours, like, does that count as an active life, right? Or is that a bit more sedentary? Correct. And so we use this daily movement as a way to invite movement into somebody's life. And if you're training for a thing like a marathon, triathlon, something like this, let's use that time deliberately to improve movement quality, right? Through some stretching and some soft tissue and some activation type work. But we could also use it for those who just want to live a healthier and better life. For sure. This is a really great example to just improve the quantity of movement that they get throughout the day. Exactly. Right? Like, let's improve the number of steps that you get. Well, how can we do that? Let's think about, the simple things of parking farther away and taking the stairs instead of the escalator. Absolutely. To plug at this move more sort of concept.
I love that. And I particularly love how you build it into their day. So one of the feedback things I got from this was like, well, we talked to all these engineers who do like long stretches of work, and they're like, oh, if I step out for a break with a stand reminder, it like messes up my flow. And that's a whole concept called maker time, where like when you're making something like writing a code or like writing a book or a paper or whatever, that you need focused activity.
Absolutely.
Like work
it's a
activity.
Flow state.
Right? It's a flow state. And so like the coach that I was talking to was like, well, their health is more important, so they should just learn to get their flow back and they should take breaks. And I love your approach, which is like, okay, look, you're going to park anyway, so park further away. You're going to take a break for coffee. Take a walk while you do that break, right? Like, build it into your day. You don't have to disrupt your day, because in the end, we also need to be productive.
Absolutely.
And so like, you can't just focus on my health and like leave everything else on the side.
And if you're a coder and you get into a flow state, you absolutely want to remain in that flow state, because we know that getting into flow comes at a cycle, right? Like there's an initial period of struggle, there's a release, you drop into flow, and then there's a recovery. So once you break that flow cycle and you sort of come back down to earth and you recognize that, well, then go fill your water bottle.
That's exactly right.
Then go, like, you know what I mean? Absolutely.
No, that's absolutely right. And so then moving on to the second part of the recommendation, which is moderate to vigorous physical activity, my huff and puff more, right? So first of all, that's a mouthful to say. But technically speaking, moderate to vigorous physical activity is a way of assessing the intensity of physical activity on a relative scale. So there's sort of two components. Like you can have absolute intensity. I've got to carry 10 kilograms or 10 pounds up a flight of stairs.
Sure.
That's a fixed amount of activity.
Yeah.
But for you and me, that might be different amounts of relative exertion.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
And so what the guidelines do is they tailor it more to the person rather than to the absolute activity. And so you want to do it at a relative state. And then it comes a matter of like measurement. So how do you measure moderate and vigorous physical activity? And so the specific thing the guidelines recommend is 75 minutes a week of vigorous, 150 minutes a week of moderate, or some combination thereof.
Sure.
Which is, again, like a lot of math and a lot of words in trying to figure that out. So
it's about 4 hours.
Yeah, right.
Slightly less than. Yeah.
And it's and so you could be very like condensed, and you could do like 75 minutes a week, which is like just over an hour. Over the course of a week, you do like 3 or 4 sessions, and you get to the recommendations, or you take a little bit longer and you do like 30, 40 minutes a day of moderate, and you'll get there. But that's a lot of work to keep up. And so what technologies like wearables do, for example, Fitbit, is they add this metrics that do the math for you.
Oh, yeah.
So Fitbit has something called active zone minutes, which is they calculate the heart rate and use heart rate reserve to figure out what zone you're in. And based on that, they give you active zone minutes, 1 minute for every minute of moderate activity, and then 2 AZMs, or active zone minutes, for every minute of vigorous activity. And so they all have to just add up to 150.
Sure.
And it's at least 150, and then you can do more. And so I'm curious, like, so that's the recommendation. That's how like a smartwatch might help you get there. How would you build that into somebody? Like you're talking to a client, like what do you do with this?
So you gave the example of carrying 10 kilos up a flight of stairs, right? Like we would call that an external load, right? That's some external, that's an activity that you're doing, right? And an external load is going to carry an internal load, which would be the zone or the zones, right? The internal load is sort of the way that you organize your physiology to accomplish the external load. And it's going to be, and as you said, it's 100% individual.
Right.
If you and I both go for the same run, the way that you respond to that run is going to be very different to the way that I respond to that run, based on our exposure to the activity of running, you know, in the recent past, right? How much load have you accumulated? And so when we think about prescribing or recommending zones for our ESD sessions, energy systems development sessions, which are, you know, what we call cardiovascular training or interval training, is we look at a 3-zone system, right? A yellow zone for low intensity, a green zone for moderate intensity, and a red zone for high intensity. And so it sounds like what's counting as the moderate intensity or the moderate level of work in the huff and puff recommendation, that we would certainly call that a green zone. And the vigorous intensity, that would be our red zone type ESD sessions, or the time that we spend in specific sessions in that higher intensity zone.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And the thing that I think is useful about those, right? Like, so you can map that to both your device, but also how people feel. So, for example, you know, Fitbit, as an example, uses 3 zones. They have fat burn, cardio, and peak as their 3 zones, right? And so the fat burn is your moderate, and then your cardio is your vigorous. Now, peak is technically still part of your vigorous, but at that point, you're pushing it. And so what you risk at that point is, like, if you're an elite person, you're an athlete, you're trying to get to the next level, you might want to be in that zone. But for the average person, for most of us who are like weekend warriors and so on, there's a risk of injury if you spend too much time in peak.
At that high intensity.
At the high intensity. And so you want to be very careful about how much time you spend there.
Right.
The other thing is, like, now there's all these wonderful formulas. We use heart rate reserve. In the gyms, you might see 220 minus age, et cetera, right? These are population formulas. That you'd get a large group of people, historically often white men. So, and then say, on average, this is what this looks like for you.
How people respond.
How people respond. Taking that and just immediately plugging it into somebody, like, you have to be at this heart rate zone, or else this doesn't count. It's a little counterintuitive. What you really want to be doing is saying, like, hey, this is what the device tells you you're at, or this is whatever heart rate measurement you have. Sometimes the machine has it. This is what zone we think you're at. How do you feel? And there might be somebody who has, for example, for whatever biologic reason, a low resting heart rate, not from fitness, but just because they happen to have it. And there's an athlete who's super trained and also has a low resting heart rate.
They've earned that lower
They've
heart
earned
rate.
it, right? Like from their activity. And so you're like, oh, you technically fit into the peak zone or moderate zone,
right.
But the person who's got this low heart rate not from activity is like struggling. You're like, oh my God, this feels so hard. Whereas the athlete's like, yeah, you're right, this is kind of easy.
Yeah.
And so you have to then double check, right? Like say, what's your perceived exertion, and how do you rate that?
Yeah.
And then tie that back into the numbers. And so when you develop your programs, what you don't want to do is just sort of blindly follow a zone pattern without checking in with your client. Like, hey, how are you feeling with this? Right?
Yeah.
Like, does that make sense?
You program to the person, not the data.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
exactly.
That these should be ways to enhance and to verify somebody's intuition about how hard it is that they're working, right? Like,
That's right.
And this is where I think the idea of these personalized zones is so valuable, because it could be exactly the same activity, exactly the same external load, right? 10 kilos up a flight of stairs, but the internal load associated with that, the physiological way that you make that activity is going to be 100% unique and 100% individual. And so when we think about going and applying these, that's where I really appreciate this idea of, and I need to realign that moderate is that yellow zone, right? That lower intensity, which is just going to be, above maybe a baseline level, right? And that green and red are going to be the vigorous, right? And sometimes we want to get that. And I know that coaches typically in a 1 hour session, and even in a time poor session, 45 or 30 minutes, it's only really going to be maybe 15% of the time that we spend doing true cardiovascular training.
Yeah.
And so in that time, really that's where we're bang for buck in terms of metabolic cost and caloric return and these sorts of things. We really want to prioritize these higher intensity, more vigorous type zones. And then it sounds like just sort of moving throughout the session, right? Doing a little bit of your pillar prep and movement prep, your warm up, doing a little bit more of your strength type work, right? Like the work that you're doing, that may count as your moderate. Absolutely. Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I'll wrap up by just going back to the importance of the guidelines. So all this sounds great, but like, so what, right? Like and we all hear like physical activity is good for you. And what the science says, what that big report says, is that people who achieve the guidelines tend to have 40% lower rates of diabetes, 35% lower rates of heart disease, and even things like fall, dementia, depression, 20% lower, things like breast cancer, colon cancer, 20% lower. So really important like health outcomes. And then on a personal short-term basis, like because these take years to develop, more focus, better sleep, more energy, right? Like, so a lot of like short-term benefits too. And I think part of the importance of this is as you're coaching your clients is to bring them back to like, why are you doing this? This is so that, and make it meaningful for them, right? Like for me, it might be, I want to be active so I can spend more time with my kids or have more energy, or, those kinds of things. And you tie it back to them, because not everybody can be like, oh, 10 years from now, this will help me prevent a heart attack. Like that doesn't just get most people up and going. You sort of have to tie it to their life in meaningful sort of ways.
Yeah, tie it back to their values, tie it back to their motivations, right? What we call their psychological drivers. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that we're animals who are meant to move, right? Like, and so finding ways to plug either through daily movement or through ESD, right? More opportunity to improve either the quantity or the quality of the intensity of the work that you're doing. I think that's really valuable and easy.
For sure. And I think the more we do that in ways that are meaningful to people, the more they'll be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really good.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks, doctor.
Yeah, of course.